Well, today we're opening a new exhibit on the 20th anniversary of Katrina. The exhibit, before we redid it, you left here crying, depressed. It was all the horrible things that the city and the state went through. But we wanted to show the recovery, the before and after pictures, the stories, the protections in place to protect the city now. And we hope Louisiana residents leave proud of the progress we've made. And for visitors from around the world, we hope they leave here knowing if their city or their town goes through devastation, when all hope seems lost, you can recover and you can come back better than ever. And I think they did a great job of showing that protection, the rebuilding, better than ever, stronger. And I think you leave here with a sense of hope and pride that this city has come back better than ever. And we still have a long way to go. Every year it's getting better, and it's giving people hope for the future. And I think that's what we wanted to send a message with the new exhibit today. Well, it's important that we remember those people and the struggles. And you still see those images, those interviews of the rooftop, the Superdome. But then we wanted to tell the stories of where those people are today. They've got a job, they're back. They're living here, enjoying life, the food, the music, the culture. So we wanted to send that message that all the pain and suffering, we wanted to make sure you realize what they went through, but where we are today. We want them to remember and those lives that were lost. We want to remember the thousands of volunteers that came here to help. Many times we thought of giving up. You feel sorry for yourself, why me? But when those people put their life on hold from around the world to come here and help you and help New Orleans and help Louisiana rebuild, we want to say thank you to them, because they not only the physical help they gave us, but the inspiration, they lifted our spirits. And that's something that's really special to the people of New Orleans and surely to me. You know, for so long, people would leave the exhibit in tears and sad. And we thought it was time to talk about all the good as well that has come out of Katrina. The rebuilding, the heroes, the hard work, the efforts by the Corps of Engineers, and all of the agencies that helped us rebuild better than we were before. And I hope you leave the exhibit today with that feeling of hope and pride in what we've done to rebuild the city and the state. So thank you again for being here.
Everyone in this theater probably has a Katrina story, beginning with our former president of Jefferson Parish. What was your story?
Well, nothing really prepares you for something like Katrina coming. If all of you remember what that looked like on the television, it looked like a sci-fi movie. It looked like the entire Gulf of America was covered by this giant black swirl that was coming initially for Florida, and we all took a deep breath and said, well, thank God that's not coming our way. And then Friday afternoon, it starts arrowing closer to Alabama, and then we said, uh-oh, this could be a problem. And then when they finally said the words that New Orleans was going to be ground zero for Katrina, that was terrifying, because a lot of us here, a lot of us on this panel went through Betsy. Betsy was our benchmark. So if you said you went through a bad hurricane, well, you went through Betsy. And in a way, that kind of jaded a lot of opinions of people in New Orleans, like, well, if I stayed through Betsy and I made it, I could probably stay through this hurricane and make it as well. Really no comparison, but that was the analogy. And so Betsy was our benchmark. And really, this city was prepared maybe for another Betsy. I don't think so, but maybe for another Betsy. But it was not prepared for what Katrina could bring. So there was a foreboding that you could do really nothing about except hope that you are prepared. And I would say this, there's many books written about emergency management preparedness. Many books telling you what to get ready for. There are no books about recovery, because every recovery is different. The impacts are totally separate from every other storm, every other flood. And so when President Bush landed and met with me at the EOC on the West Bank, he said, "Mr. President, how's it going?" I said, "Mr. President, Katrina was terrible, but recovery is a living hell."
Yeah, a few days after the levees broke, I got a call from Governor Blanco, whom I did not know, and she said, "Would you be vice chair of the Louisiana Recovery Authority?" And I said, "Yes, but who's going to be the chair?" And she said, "Norman Francis." I'd known Norman ever since he was on the Civil Service Commission at City Hall, and I was a reporter there. And I said, "I'm all in." Because Norman Francis was the one person who could pull us all together and make sure we didn't have separate agendas, that it was not Democrat or Republican or black or white or uptown Ninth Ward or whatever. And that ability to remind us that we were all in the same boat was crucial when Walt Leger and I and Donna Brazil and Kip Boyle and Boise Bollinger and Norman Francis formed the Recovery Authority. And what particularly struck me is this idea that we were in the same boat. We came by helicopter from the front lawn of the governor's mansion, landed at the Superdome, and the waters hadn't totally receded. My home on Napoleon, or my family home on Napoleon Avenue, we have a picture of it with the water 8 feet up, and the house is reflected in the water. You can turn that picture 180 degrees, and you can't tell what's up, what's down, because that's where the water was. I convinced my brother to keep the FEMA cross, which thankfully said 0 dead, but said that North Carolina had come in on that day and whatever. Sarah Usden, who was then a Teach for America Corps member working for the Louisiana Recovery Authority as we were getting organized, was in the helicopter next to me. We both started crying because we thought the city would never come back. But in the end, that notion that we were in the same boat, and unlike the rest of the country that was pulling itself apart in partisan ways, we had to work with everybody from Karl Rove to Ray Nagin to whatever, and we pulled people together. And that spirit of saying that this will make us rise above partisanship is a spirit that I hope on the 20th anniversary we can re-seize.
Walt?
Well, Aaron, my story, Katrina's story, begins in Betsy. I lived in St. Bernard Parish when Betsy hit, and while New Orleans was pretty much spared by Betsy, St. Bernard was hit just as bad, really, as Katrina, except we didn't have as many people, and we had, we were built closer, to the river, so the impact wasn't so great. But we had evacuated to New Orleans, to my grandparents' house. We went back and we had 5 or 6 feet of water in our home. So after I got out of law school and we moved back to the parish and had children, every time a storm came, we loaded them in the minivan. I put life jackets on my little boy, Walt, if you can imagine that, and the other 2 kids, and we took off. Well, as Katrina approached, we were unequivocally getting out. About 10 days before the storm, I'd literally bought a house in Baton Rouge. My daughter was a student at LSU, and I wish I'd done this for the other 2 boys. So instead of paying rent, we'd have a house. We went to the act of sale, and I told the sweetheart, if we have a storm, we're coming to live with you. Well, she was thinking, yeah, Dad, we're going to be partying in this house. But a few days later, we went up there. So we were in Baton Rouge when Katrina hit, but we listened on the radio as the storm came through overnight. And we knew the path of the storm. We knew it was bad, and we knew what had happened to St. Bernard. By the next day, we heard nothing about St. Bernard, but all the national news media was saying, New Orleans has been spared. They were standing on Canal Street, right, and they said, oh yeah, the French Quarter, New Orleans is spared. We heard nothing from St. Bernard. So Walt and I, son Walt and I went driving around. We actually were able to get a condo to move the whole family into and get out of my daughter's way. And we were looking for inflatable mattresses, telephone, et cetera, and we heard on the radio that someone had actually made contact with WAFB in Baton Rouge and WGNO, which had moved in there, and said that there were 5,000 people in a warehouse on the Chalmette Slip in St. Bernard. There was no way to get automobiles or vehicles there, and they were, had no food, no water, and otherwise. So Walt and I went over to WGNO, and they thought, oh, Walter Leger from St. Bernard, he knows what's going on. I said, no, I'm here to find out what's happening. But I got on, gave out my cell phone number, and said, hey, if you got boats, call me on my cell phone. We're going down to get it. Meanwhile, I don't know if Andy's here, Andy Copeland, who became executive director of the LRA, was then Governor Blanco's chief of staff. Andy, we made our way into the Office of Emergency Preparedness. The governor and Andy and their staff had concocted a little scheme to help get the people out. And they dispatched me and Sam Jones and a couple of other staffers down on the left to the West Bank, where we eventually commandeered the 2 Algiers ferries. And we brought the ferries down and literally took people out. But I want you to know that's kind of my Katrina story at the beginning. But I want you to know as we climbed up onto that dock and looked at all of the people in that warehouse, there were several thousand people. I'm told today by the director of the port there were 5,000. They looked like zombies. They were among the thousands that had not evacuated St. Bernard, and they had been picked up and found their way there. No food, no drink. It was 3 or 4 days later. 100-degree temperature. They were baking. But as we got them on to the ferries, suddenly they started smiling and crying, and eventually moved out. Thereafter, I'm just trying to figure out how to start my law firm and this, that, and the other over the few weeks, and I got a call, Walter, from the governor, who I didn't know, by the way. My only contact had been kind of helping get people out of St. Bernard. I got a call on the interstate where at that time you would lose, you could lose the connection a lot. So, Mr. Leger, this is Governor Blanco. And I'm like, oh, okay. Pulled over, afraid I would lose contact with her, and she started explaining her dream of this Louisiana Recovery Authority. We're going to do this thing. We're going to rebuild Louisiana. It's going to be bipartisan. We'll have Republicans and Democrats and independents. We're not going to talk about politics. We're going to chart a way forward. Would you be interested in serving as a governor? I'll be there 24/7. I had no idea there'd be so many 24s and so many 7s. And then we met. We all met together and got underway. I mean, and the rest is, that was response and rescue. The rest was recovery.
I told you he was verbose. Lieutenant Governor.
So, me and my wife lived 14 miles from the eye as it crossed over Plaquemines Parish. When we built our house, we dug a lake and built a mound of mud 6 foot above the levees in case we ever had a hurricane. Go figure. And we were prepared to evacuate, but we had 20 specially trained officers. We had a riding center for special needs children. Greatest thing I ever did with my life, helping those kids. I wasn't leaving those horses. So we took them over to the house and decided to ride out the storm. I'll never forget it. The back wall, my bricks split, and the water came into the house. I had hurricane shutters. They bent in and blew the doors open. I watched barges come over the levee. We had to cut a 20-foot flatboat out the front trees, up in the trees. And right after the storm, I walked out the back door, my knees buckled. I saw animals swimming. South of ConocoPhillips, we were the only thing sticking out the water. Something told me get in the airboat with my ranch hand and head south. We rescued 34 people, lived with us for months. Some of them I didn't know their names. And we started to clean the highway, ended up housing volunteers in my barn, but I never saw a politician. Went to borrow some pumps in Belle Chase and told I'd be arrested if I touched them. Even though they wasn't using them, Belle Chase was not underwater. They didn't care about nothing south of Belle Chase. That's what ended up making me mad enough to run for lieutenant governor. But yeah, it's something that I don't sleep good at any time a storm gets in the Gulf from what we went through for Katrina. And then Mike Strain's dad and uncle lived with me for 6 months rescuing animals. Hundreds of animals off rooftops, out of trees. We had to get cattle down from houses that they had washed in 16 feet off the ground. And just incredible stories. But the thing I remember the most, when you thought about giving up, when you felt sorry for yourself or this is too much, another group of volunteers that you never knew showed up to help. And so it wasn't so much the physical help they gave you. It was, wow, if they can put their life on hold and come help us, you just got to keep moving forward. And I thank God for those volunteers because they came from all over. And they came with a smile, and they came to help. And to this day, I'm forever grateful for those people.
Representative Kerner?
Yeah, well, I can remember I was at the Hilton Hotel getting ready for a big party with Sheriff Harry Lee when it happened.
Can we get that?
Perfect timing. But so then we was watching the weather, and I had to talk my wife out of staying at the Hilton because she was hard-headed. So I finally got her to leave, and I went back to Lafitte, Barrington, and Crown Point, and we started putting up a couple 100,000 sandbags, and parish president was part of helping with that, and so we put up the sandbags, and the only hurricane that I ever left for was Katrina. The parish had talked me into it, and they said, look, a couple of your hard-headed friends are not going to leave unless you leave, and we worried about them. So I went across the lake with them, and so when we got back, I was actually the vice president of the West Jefferson Levee District at the time, too, and my good friend Chip Kaya was the president. So when we got back, we saw the devastation in New Orleans, and the East Jefferson Levee District, for whatever reason, they couldn't work. I don't know if it was underwater or what. New Orleans was underwater, and so we took over the project to close that gap in the levee by the 17th Street Canal, and it was a crazy time because we had to build a road, a riprap road, a shell road going to where the gap was in the levee, and then we started putting riprap in where the levee was broke, and so. It was crazy because all you saw in the news was the helicopters coming in, were dropping the big rock bags. I wasn't doing hardly anything. Matter of fact, it was actually dangerous because we were getting the riprap right for the dump trucks, right where they were actually picking the bags up. So they were throwing rocks all over our guys and everything. And so we said, man, it's kind of dangerous. And they said, well, look, it looks good on TV. We're not stopping. So that's what we did. So we were, while we were doing that, closing that gap in, I was riding to Lafitte. And I had a couple guys that stood on boats and a couple families that rode out the hurricane. And they started picking up a couple trees off the road and everything. But if you drove down there, every roof was destroyed. It was just a mess. And, I mean, it was horrible. And they had these 15, 20 people saying, man, we're over here in this little corner. And I'm like, man, you're not doing it. You really, it's really good you volunteer, you're doing it, but it's just so small, the effort. So what we did, we got a contractor to come in and actually started moving all the debris from the right-of-ways. And by doing that, from Lafitte, Barrington, Crown Point, Lower Lafitte, we were able to get Entergy and the gas companies in there faster than anybody. Because what they was doing they would go out and do an assessment, and then they would try to line up somebody to do that work. We actually got people that went there and did it right away. And so Lafitte, as hard as we were hit, we were one of the first ones back with power. But, and I got to say, just like what the Lieutenant Governor said too, it was amazing because all branches of government came together because, right after the hurricane, people couldn't work, fishermen couldn't, if their boat was all right, nobody was there to buy the seafood and everything else was closed, so nobody was making a living. So not only did you have to try to find them some type of income, you had to find them food to eat at the time, you had to find formula, baby diapers, and just all kinds of stuff. And everybody was actually on their back. God, I don't know why I'm choking up. Hey, give me a break. I had a little minor prostate surgery yesterday, so I probably shouldn't be here. But I will tell you, it was very difficult. And so what we did at Town Hall, we set up a deal with all kinds of government agencies to try to make it where not only you could. We had truckloads of food outside, diapers and formula and everything, but anything that you may have, whether income, whether it was unemployment payments. And then, same thing Lieutenant Governor said, the church groups and nonprofits, because the poorest of the poor a lot of times don't meet the requirements for government help for whatever reason. Whether they got help once before at FEMA and they couldn't afford the insurance and they had to not pay it and they didn't meet the requirements, you had to make sure that they got help also. And the church groups and nonprofits did it. So.
Thank you, gentlemen. You have eloquently set the stage for where you were and what happened. I wonder if you would indulge us now with a conversation about recovery. And I'm going to ask Mr. Isaacson and Mr. Leger to lead us in that discussion in which you all can participate. The Road Home program had to be designed quickly. But over time, critics pointed to its frequently changing rules, its slow pace, and faulty home valuations, resulting in a class action lawsuit. If you had to start over, what would you do differently?
Let me take that, Walter, a little bit, because I was a little bit intimately involved in what went on. And you have to frame it in what happened at the beginning. Politically, Governor Blanco really appointed some really spectacular people, including Norman Francis and Walter and David Velker and Sean Riley and others, and Boise Bollinger, whose job it was, among others, to help us get funding from Washington to actually rebuild Louisiana. This was the biggest tragedy in the history of the country, still is. Initially, the first tranche of money sent from Washington, $5 billion, was sent to Mississippi, $6.2 billion was sent to us. We had 5 to 10 times the damage Mississippi had. We barely got a little bit more than Mississippi got. At the end of the day, and look, they had pretty tough damage there, but at the end of the day, they only spent about half of it on homeowner stuff. I mean, they built a baseball stadium there. We were still trying to repair our New Orleans Zephyrs stadium. But so part of our job was we had to develop enough money to actually, we had lost 200,000 homes. We had almost a million people that were evacuated and that became evacuees. We lost 18,000 businesses, 240,000 people lost their jobs. Mississippi had about a quarter of those numbers in each category. We lost 40 schools totally destroyed. And so we had to rebuild those things, and we had to go get the money. At the end of the day, we should have, if they got $5 billion, we should have gotten 20 or 25 billion. We only had 6.2 billion. So we had to begin designing a program where the hard work was going to be Walters and Norman Francis and those guys to convince Congress that we needed more money. I don't know why the governor appointed me to be chairman of the Housing and Redevelopment Task Force. It was the one task force I didn't want to have anything to do with, that I didn't think I knew anything about. She later told me, though, over martinis in a restaurant after we were lobbying in Washington, I asked her, why me? She said, you had lost your home. She had seen my home after the storm. We flew in on helicopters, a bunch of us in the Recovery Authority. We went to the lower Ninth Ward, and it looked like an atomic bomb had hit it. We rolled into St. Bernard Parish and eventually to my home, and you could see homes knocked over into the street. We went into my home. Someone wanted to say, hey, can you show us the inside of a house? So Jack Stevens took us to my house, not telling him it was mine, and Sean Riley from Baton Rouge said, man, do you know the people that own this house? Yes, I do. It's mine. So we had 15 feet of water, in St. Bernard. You had 20 and 30 feet of water. Jack Stevens showed me marsh grass, the sheriff showed me marsh grass in a tower that was 30 feet high. There was a 70-foot shrimp boat on a piece of property. So and I'm just talking about St. Bernard, not to mention the larger numbers in New Orleans that we had to find a way to finance. And so we actually developed, and I have it, I brought paper just as a crutch. A meeting that you and I voted to support, to develop the Road Home program on in January of 2006, we still didn't have enough money. But the program that was originally developed was a program that would have accommodated almost every penny of reconstruction. And it would have provided where there were gaps. It would have provided for forgivable loans at the end if you remained in your house. Governor Blanco's words were, we're not just going to give people money and let them, encourage them to leave. We want to rebuild homes and rebuild Louisiana. So that was the goal. And by the way, to fully answer your question, so we did that. And we eventually obtained about $13.4 billion. because of the hard work of Walter and the others on the LRA. I went up there and testified 3 or 4, maybe 6, 7 times before congressional committees as a homeowner, as a volunteer. And we eventually were able to get some assistance. By the way, and I mean, you asked because you pointed out some of the criticisms of the program. That's why I'm telling you. The Speaker of the House of Representatives in the early going said, I don't think we should rebuild parts of New Orleans and St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish if they're in a flood zone. I don't like to say his name, but his initials are Dennis Hastert. Well, I mean, it still makes me angry to think of that. Governor Blanco and all of us said, we are rebuilding Louisiana. We just got to get the money. So eventually we got the money, put a program together. The banks were involved. The money was going to be released. It's not the one that we ended up with. It was going to be released as people built their homes, and we're going to get forgivable loans on March 7th, 2007, another day that will live in infamy. HUD suddenly, after approving every step of the way, HUD notified the governor, we're withdrawing all the waivers. That program's dead. We're not going to approve that program. And so suddenly, having to have leveraged the money that we got, and the program was killed. And so we started rebuilding the boat that we'd already launched that was not complete. No playbook for recovery, as you pointed out, Aaron. We started doing it again. I'm going to touch on it because you mentioned the class action lawsuit. Also, a tender part in my heart as a class action lawyer. The state was sued basically for discriminating with respect to the road home program. A district judge in Washington granted a preliminary injunctions on the evidence that was presented, with really the other side, the state side, not getting to oppose it. The short version of that is a 3-judge panel of the district circuit in Washington unanimously reversed it and said there was no discrimination, there was no disparate treatment, there was no otherwise. In fact, with the money that we had available, we had done it pretty fairly. And at the end of the day, when you look back today, we used that money to rebuild, to help people rebuild 130,000 homes. To this day, it's still larger than any of the other rebuilding programs of like the top 5 most devastating storms in history. And in New Orleans, the average grant, by the way, and we had Hurricane Rita 3 weeks later that we were in charge of as well. So we brought people onto the LRA from Southwest Louisiana. But the average grant was $69,000 statewide. But the average grant in New Orleans was $95,000. The average grant in St. Bernard Parish was $88,000, where the damage was. We rebuilt 46,000 homes in New Orleans, another 12,000 in St. Bernard Parish. And so, I mean, on the whole, while there's been criticism by people that don't really understand what transpired, we had a pretty successful program. But by the way, my job was, the other part the governor said, you're a lawyer, your job is to criticize the program. Your job is to pick it apart. Your job is to act as a homeowner as you are and talk about what are we doing wrong. And one great thing that the LRA under the leadership of Norman Francis and Walter Isaacson did, and particularly Governor Blanco, was said, when we find out we've messed up, we're not going to hide it, we're going to change it. And that's what happened over time. And so at the end of the day, it was really pretty successful, despite the criticisms that kind of float around on it. And there was no bigger critic than me. You asked, so apologize for telling you so much, but it was a lot. It was complicated, and there was a lot to it. And we fought HUD every inch of the way. It was not an easy battle. We fought members of Congress every inch of the way. And I have to mention one other senator whose initials I also will use, Tom Coburn, from the state of Oklahoma. He came to a committee that I was testifying at, and he told us, well, we're not going to, we can't give you any more money. The only reason we're giving you money is because the levees failed, and the federal levees failed. And to that, I responded, as you would expect a lawyer to respond. So if you want to compensate us fully, what you ought to do, because the federal government failed us, is you should remove the immunity of the Corps of Engineers from being sued and let us sue you, and you compensate everyone for their actual loss. Instead, we got cap on damages. We got a $150,000 cap that everyone got. So we worked with it, and we did the best we could. But we actually, I'm pretty proud of where we ended up, and I think everyone was pretty proud. But mostly, and I at some point I was going to say this, I have to just thank Kathleen Blanco for everything that she did. She was a warrior, she was a wise person and a gentle and smart person and an empathetic person, and her heart was right there and her brain was even better. So, more than you wanted probably, Norm.
Now, we're not under any time constraints here. This is not a television program, so you're at liberty to say what you have to say.
Which Walter? Never have too many Walters. Just a couple of points. You talk about Mississippi, Louisiana getting the thing, the difference that we got. I was there when President Bush came to New Orleans, then went to, I think, Pass Christian, which is where Trent Lott, I think, had a house that had been destroyed. We're standing in the backyard there, and I'm arguing with the head of the Mississippi Recovery Authority, who happens to be Jim Barksdale, who I knew way back. And I said, you know, we have this much damage, we have that much. And he said to me, he said, well, we've got the head of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, and we've got the head of the Finance Committee. And then he said to me, let's quit fighting over divvying up the proceeds until we finish robbing the stagecoach. And so we worked together with them to get more money for both states. I say that because there was a theme throughout all of this that we had to work together, and that if we got into a fight with Mississippi or if Baton Rouge got in a fight with New Orleans, not going to be good. As for mistakes made, there were quite a few mistakes made, I think, on the Recovery Authority. It'd be surprising if there weren't. We had to do things like pre-Katrina value decisions. We had to keep it going slowly, the Road Home program, because we wanted people to show that they actually own the house. They had to produce documentation. That may have been a bad decision, because it was very hard for people at times to produce documentation. But that being the person who had to go back and forth to the White House and Al Hubbard and Karl Rove, it was, you're just going to steal the money, there's going to be huge amounts of fraud, there's going to be headlines in every paper that all the money went to people who didn't own homes. So perhaps we erred on the side of preventing those stories. There were no stories. No money got, there was no fraud, no abuse, not even an accusation of it, but it did mean we went too slowly in giving the money back to people who had problems getting documentation. I say this, I was on the education side, we did some things. But let me say one thing about the mistakes, whether it was pre-Katrina value or going to an autonomous school system or all, we made sure, and it just happened naturally, that nobody had an agenda. There wasn't a left and a right or a partisan dispute. Right. And Norman helped make all the decisions, but even in the end, when it was a question of rebuilding value, pre-Katrina value, whatever, and what compromise we had to make with HUD, there wasn't, you know, Donna Brazil on one side and Boise Bollinger on the other side. Right. We tried to get it right. Likewise with schools. Likewise with the documentation you needed. So every mistake that was made was an honest mistake, not done by partisanship or people bringing into those meetings an agenda.
Mm-hmm. Lieutenant Governor.
So I want to toot Kathleen Blanco's horn too. I took office a year after Katrina. And in my first meeting with HUD, Ray Nagin, and Mary Landrieu, they were talking about this $200 million that was sitting in a fund for federal levies and placards that I knew nothing about. And they wanted my permission to move it to New Orleans so they could get the next round of funding in place. And I said, well, wait a minute, why don't we were left out of all the plans because there was a year gap of really anyone attending the meetings. Benny was on his way out of office and just didn't go. So I said, I'll tell you what, if you leave enough money to engineer and design federal levies, and you give me your word, the next round of funding, whatever it costs, placards will be included, I don't have a problem you moving the 160 million. Ray Nagin said, I agree with that, so did the governor. And they didn't dream the cost would be over $2 billion. So the Corps used to tell me, who did you know to get $2 billion to protect all that cow pasture? Well, now we're seeing development down there, because we had a 4-foot levee in Plaquemines. And that's why there was never any development down there, because we flooded 3 times after Katrina. But that's how we got the federal levees built. And the governor, even when it came back over $2 billion, a couple people in the room said that's too much money. And the governor said, oh no, we made a commitment, we're going to build those levees in Plaquemines. So had Blanco not stood tall, Plaquemines would not have gotten those levees. And on another instance, the Corps was going to rebuild our pump stations, making parts, because our motors were so old. And one of our consultants said, FEMA will build them back elevated if the Corps will give them up. And the colonel at the time said, no, we're tasked by the parish to rebuild them, we're going to rebuild them. And on a conference call, David Vitta said, listen, he said, well, that's the law. David Vitta said, I wrote the law, give up those pump stations, let the parish president go to FEMA. And today we have elevated pump stations with generator backups, thanks to Senator Vitta getting the Corps to release those pump stations that they were going to build back at double the cost on the ground, because the parish had tasked them with that task early on. So Senator Vitta really helped us out there, and Governor Blanco, in a parish that didn't have enough voters to swing any election. So they really had a care for helping the people of Plaquemines Parish, and they should be rewarded in the members of Plaquemines, because the development happened in Plaquemines today would have never happened without those two things.
Representative Kerner.
Road Home was a good program, and any program like that, when you're helping people, it's good. I just wish they would have had a better qualifying team to make sure that the truly needy didn't have to wait as long as some of them did, because some of them did. And I know there wasn't that much abuse in it, but in some cases I saw the truly greedy get a little help before the truly needy. So I just wish they would have had a better qualifying system to move the truly needy faster along the way.
Mr. Broussard, how did you see it from your parish? How did you see the Road Home?
Well, the Road Home was one of the most incredible programs, I think, ever devised, and it brought real relief to people who were desperate for a chance to rebuild. The people that wanted to stay, they were getting the pushback from the insurance companies.
That's right.
That, well, you know, we don't think there's more flood there than there is wind, and, you know, whether they lost their roof or not, they were counting it all as flood. So they were getting a tremendous pushback from them. They got in, did the hard work, took the sheetrock out of the houses, and so they're living on concrete slabs in Jefferson. I remember in Lafitte, I was there with one poor lady, and she was sweeping the crabs, the live crabs, out of the kitchen in Lafitte. Yeah. And people are on slabs, their houses are studs, and they're waiting. They're just waiting, and it's the terrible feeling. You know, they did the mold remediation, and they want to stay, but they're in an intolerable situation. Even with electricity, they got AC on, but the house is a skeleton. So the Road Home gave them hope. And in the aftermath of Katrina, hope was the most powerful medicine that you could give someone, because it was, in essence, a hopeless situation. If your home was destroyed, the insurance that you counted on was not coming to the rescue, and you were trying to battle elements as raw as food and water, and how am I going to sustain myself? Road Home gave hope. I knew people, including my mother. My mother was one of those that was staying in a slab in her late 80s, you know, in studs. I said, Mom, I got to get you out this house. No, I'm not leaving my house. I'm staying in my house. And so I watched her wait out Road Home. But Road Home came to the rescue of many, many, many people. And I dare say we would have lost maybe 100,000 more people in this region if there wasn't a program like y'all put in place to give hope. Because the hope came first and the relief came later. but people held out for the hope that they could stay and rebuild. Awesome program, one of the finest in the country. They should use it as a template for other places that are faced with similar situations. But God bless you guys, because y'all kept the flame burning. And we were caught in a turmoil, like you say, what is Mississippi, was it getting as much money as it was? We didn't figure it out at the local level. Red state, blue state, you know, you got a Democratic governor, you got a Republican governor. They were making sure, you had a Republican president, they were making sure Mississippi was going to be well taken care of. We were kind of, you know, going to get what we could get. We didn't see that at play. I couldn't figure that out, in fact, with FEMA. Talk about frustration. I'm just letting my remarks flow. But that frustration of abandonment in the early weeks, that nobody was coming to help us. Didn't realize the chess game being played at the federal and the state level about federalizing troops and this and that. Harry Lee calls up his contacts at Walmart, truckloads of water come to the Jefferson Parish border. FEMA turns back the trucks. We don't need the water. You said, what? FEMA comes into Jefferson Parish. The only operating communication system we had was the sheriff's tower. FEMA comes in and cuts the wires of our tower and plugs in their communication system. Harry Lee gets on WWL radio and said, I'm coming back out there with my deputies with guns, and we're disconnecting FEMA, and we're putting in our communication system. There was free food being given out. And everybody that had a means to give food was given food, and FEMA was shutting down those operations. I couldn't figure it out. Figured it out years later. FEMA had contractors that had bid on this work, you know, years in advance, hoping on the come that there'd be a tragedy, and they would ship their water in from Michigan or wherever they got. They'd ship it in and make their money. And so they were turning back all this stuff. It was so bizarre. And then where was the Calvary? At one moment in frustration, WWL radio embedded in the EOC where we were. And at one moment of frustration, I announced that Jefferson Parish was withdrawing from the United States. That I was creating my own country, Jefferpotamia. And Jefferpotamia was now a third world country, and we were in need. So where's the food? Where's the Red Cross? Where's everything that I saw being delivered to every other country in the world that needed something? Now that I'm independent, bring it on. Bring it on. I want to throw out kudos. After my tearful appeal on national TV, the governor of Maryland, Robert Ehrlich, spontaneously sent me almost 500 National Guardsmen. They were all MASH. They were doctors, they were nurses, they were pharmacists, they were med techs. He just flew them in. I didn't until they came and saluted me at EOC. I didn't even know they were there. And he sent them in because all of his other National Guard units were in Iraq. So he sent me what he had. And I was able to stage in elementary schools, based on my school board experience, the walking distance. The poorest neighborhoods in Jefferson Parish couldn't evacuate. They didn't evacuate. And it didn't dawn on me the problems we had until I started getting handwritten notes. Kids were coming up on bikes on Ames Boulevard. We need food. My auntie is a diabetic, you know, needs medicine. We're getting handwritten notes. I said, oh my God, you know, we got a problem. So we put those National Guard in the elementary schools of the poorest neighborhoods in Jefferson Parish, East Bank and West Bank. And those doctors and nurses, they saved lives. They went into homes. They gave shots with people with diabetic shocks. They identified the people that needed dialysis, all the people that were out of their medications. They got them medications. Every year that I was parish president after that, on the anniversary of Katrina, I flew the Maryland flag. And then he asked me to come up to speak to the joint session of the legislature, Senate and House in Maryland. He said I was the first citizen in Maryland history ever to address them. And I thank them personally on behalf of all of Jefferson Parish for sending me their best when we needed it the worst.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have been intrigued by your stories thus far. As a journalist, and I think I can speak for most of us, our impression of the federal government changed overnight as a result of how the federal government itself was reacting to what happened in southeast Louisiana and Mississippi. I'd like to ask each of you as an elected official and a policymaker, what shaped or reshaped your feelings or opinion about the federal government's responsibility to a crisis after Hurricane Katrina?
I'll go first. Well, you know, we went up, a lot of us went up and met with the governor of New York and New Jersey, and ultimately a lot of our input resulted in the Sandy Act, which fixed some things. You no longer had to build the school in Port Salt because that's where it was. You didn't get penalized, and it should have been moved to Belchase in a safer place. So it changed a few things, but it's still broken. And you know, we were asked to, as the president looks to get rid of FEMA or whatever his plans are, to weigh in on it. And one of the ideas that we threw out was that, you know, they bring all these people in that go door to door. We find them throwing the reports in the garbage. They don't really care. They're here to make a buck. And with technology today, if you wanted to save a lot of money, you'd put a regional FEMA person over 3-5 states. When there's no hurricane or no event, he gets to know all the officials. But we also document the value of every infrastructure, public building, and the homes. And we put $1 on that value there. So when the disaster happens, he flies in, meets with the governor, the mayor, the parish president, and says, we're 60% damaged. Here's what we've both agreed on is the value prior to the storm. Just give us a check. Let us go build it back the best way, and let's get to work, instead of spending 6 months writing reports. And that way, you cut through all the red tape, you get it done quickly, and you've got some pretty clear, and if it's only 60% damage and you're asking for 80% of the money, no, we're going to bring it back down to what you really lost. And I think that's a quick way, and you save hundreds of millions of dollars of people putting them up in hotels, walking door to door, and fighting with figures. I mean, today with technology, we can do that. And so as we talk to Congress and the president, let's fix it to where we can respond quicker and get the money in the hands of the states quicker.
So are you more or less confident?
I'm halfway there. Now get that done, I'll feel more confident.
Let me add on to what my hero told you about the federal government. And I didn't know this. I was just a little country lawyer from the parish who had handled some pretty complicated cases. But I knew nothing about rebuilding and recovery and government regulations, or even what you public officials really do and the responsibility. But when we met, we were explaining, Governor Blanco hired some of the top consultants in the country to come educate us and teach us. And particularly when I became head of the Housing Redevelopment Task Force, was that I guess I got to learn something about housing. And what they told us was FEMA is going to provide, individual homeowners assistance is one thing they do, which a lot of people got, but the big deal is the public assistance, and that is to provide reimbursements to rebuild public assets, buildings. Sheriff's Department, $100 million given the sheriff in St. Bernard to replace his automobiles. I think $20 billion of FEMA public assistance was given eventually to the whole state of Louisiana. You probably got some, Tim. Every entity, Jefferson got a bunch of public assistance dollars. But what our charge was, as the Louisiana Recovery Authority, was to use CDBG money. Mm-hmm. It took me weeks to remember those letters. But that's community development block grant money. That's what HUD handed out for rebuilding purposes. We were told, I remember distinctly, it's like a video, CDBG money is the easiest money federal money to spend. It's got the lease regulations, the lease strings. This is going to be easy. If that's true, I don't know how they ever spend any money, because it became very complicated. We were tied up in the Stafford Act and a bunch of their regulations. HUD imposed this pre-storm value thing on us in calculating things. It came from HUD. We didn't invent that. I didn't know what a pre-storm value is. That's banker talk. That's federal, that's federal talk. Today, and your question is really, what did we learn about the federal government? What was the impact? What did we think of it? Didn't think a lot of it back then. Because when we fought to develop this program within the restraints they gave us, and by the way, people like Andy Copeland and Walter and Walter Isaacson and the chairman negotiated, we generally negotiated things that could kind of work, waivers from HUD of some of their regulations, and developed a program much better than the one that ultimately came out. But at the end of the day, we were constrained by all of those regulations, and the waivers were just waved away. And then we had to kind of start over again. But today, we taught HUD some lessons. HUD doesn't use pre-storm value anymore. You talked about, again, Aaron, that there's no playbook for recovery. There really certainly wasn't back in 2005. There are some playbooks now, and their various option offenses and passing offenses and running offenses today that is better. I think, I'm not an expert, but I've followed it pretty closely. Today, things are different.
Okay.
And I would
It's a bit
submit.
of a metaphor that we,
Go ahead. And at least the experts, that I've followed, say that they're different. They're doing things a lot better, or at least they were before a few months ago. And then we saw what happened in Kerr County, Texas, which
Yes.
was a total disintegration of
Yeah.
all of the advances FEMA made in the last 20 years, I think. And hopefully, my own view is we can't get rid of FEMA. You can call it something else. We used to have, F used to stand for something else. We had things we called it and used those letters back then, but you have to have, we have to have a federal response. Texas even demonstrated as big and rich as they are, they have difficulty responding to disasters. Poor states like us, we're going to get another storm.
Oh, yeah.
Mississippi, Alabama, we need the help. Maybe we should regionalize the approaches. Develop offenses, a running offense for the Gulf Coast, the passing offense for the Tornado Alley or otherwise. We should also make the head of FEMA cabinet level and not subject to political appointment and term limit. There's a whole bunch of things we could do. But we learned, I think we wrote the playbook by the mistakes. And by, as Walter said before, the decision made by him and our leaders and Governor Blanco to just go work it out. Let's fight with them, but make it work. And eventually, even the federal government learns lessons.
All right. Walter?
let me tell you a story. About a month after the storm, still didn't have traffic lights working in St. Bernard and parts of Lower 9. Electricity wasn't on. We're in the back of Mother's Restaurant. You're there, big round table, Benny Russell, all the parish presidents, me and Dr. Francis. The Archbishop is there for, I guess, good reasons. President of the United States, George Bush, and Laura Bush. Everybody's going around the table. And I don't know, it wasn't your person, but explaining how the lights aren't yet on, and the traffic lights aren't working in St. Bernard, and some of the lights aren't on in Lower 9. And President Bush says, why is that? And the FEMA, this was Michael Brown, the FEMA director said, well, it's still unclear under the Stafford Act as to whether the generators are a capital cost or an operating cost. And we're still trying to figure out, because HUD has to decide whether or not an SBA, that sort of thing. And President Bush nods ahead, and they go around to the next person who starts talking. Mrs. Bush turned to me and said, well, did they just say the electricity's still not on in Lower 9? And I said, yeah, it's not. And they said that the lights aren't working because no electricity? I said, yes, Mrs. Bush. She pauses, she says, George, she's across the table. They were going around, other people talking. George, they said the electricity's not still on, and they're debating over how to fix it the way it is. They can't do anything until the electricity goes back on. And President Bush smartly nodded his wife, and then he said to Michael Chertoff, who was there, who's then Homeland Security, get the electricity back on. And boom, it happened. And I will say one other thing, that Michael Chertoff then fired Michael Brown the next day. So, the point of the story is that waivers, as Walt just said, don't just happen.
Right.
They happen because real people use some common sense and have some empathy. And that's what we're most lacking now, is not processes for waivers, but people like Laura Bush.
Yeah. The quotes that made Time magazine for me when Brownie was in charge of FEMA. I said, FEMA is being run by idiots. I said, we need better idiots. We need caring idiots. We need idiots with common sense. We need idiots with energy. I said, FEMA is idiots. Again, looking back at what happened to FEMA, and is still part of what FEMA lacks today. FEMA was a different FEMA during Hurricane Andrew. And when you had Whit came in and was assisting Governor Blanco and whatever, when he was in charge of FEMA and Oklahoma, Obama and everything, man, FEMA was running like a top. Well, then comes 9/11. When 9/11 comes, the president decides to form Homeland Security, a whole new level of bureaucracy without funding.
True.
Where did the funding come from to launch Homeland Security? Basically gutted what would have been staff that would have been permanent staff with FEMA.
Right.
They took out the lower tiers, kept the upper tiers, and pushed that money to Homeland Security.
In the not-too-distant future, I predict the sounds of hammers and saws will be ringing through all of our communities as our homes are rebuilt. And not too long after that, we will hear the voices of children returning to our neighborhoods. That will be a great day for Louisiana.
What a way to close.
Great job. Thank you, man. That was good. It was good.
Love you.
Yeah.
Good to see you, man.